Discover the chilling tale of a man who buys a fragment of an ancient torture rack at an auction, only to be haunted by the spirit of its former torturer. Listen to how he's compelled to reconstruct the gruesome device while the ghost plots to seize control of his body. Don't miss this spine-tingling journey into terror. The rain drizzled outside, casting a sombre mood over the small, dimly lit auction house. Nestled among the array of peculiar antiques and forgotten relics, Jonathan Harker stood silently, his gaze fixated on a peculiar item on display. It was a fragment of an old torture rack, its dark wood and rusted iron exuding an eerie aura. Jonathan, a history enthusiast with a penchant for the macabre, was drawn to it like a moth to a flame. He had heard tales of the rack's origin, used in medieval times by a notorious torturer known for his cruel and innovative methods. Such dark history only fueled Jonathan's fascination. As the auctioneer called for bids, Jonathan's hand shot up almost involuntarily. The room was thick with an uncomfortable silence, the other bidders seemingly hesitant or perhaps wisely disinterested in the grim artifact. The price was surprisingly low, and within moments the piece was his. Feeling a mixture of triumph and an inexplicable sense of dread, Jonathan approached to claim his prize. As his fingers brushed against the cold, rough surface of the rack, a shiver ran down his spine. It was as if the wood whispered secrets of a bygone era, echoes and screams etched into its grain. The auctioneer, an elderly man with knowing eyes, handed the piece of wood over to Jonathan. "Be wary, young man," he said, his voice tinged with a seriousness that seemed out of place. "Some items carry more than just history. They bear the weight of souls long gone." Jonathan chuckled nervously, dismissing the old man's words as mere superstition. He carried the rack fragment to his car, the rain now pouring in earnest, as if the heavens themselves wept for the artifact's release. Back at his home, Jonathan placed the piece in his study, a room filled with other historical artifacts and books. That night, as he lay in bed, the house seemed unusually quiet, the silence almost oppressive. It was then that he heard it for the first time, a faint whisper, barely audible, like the hiss of a distant wind. He dismissed it as a figment of his imagination, a side effect of the day's excitement. But as the days passed, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They called out in a language he couldn't understand, yet the message was clear. He needed to complete the rack. Desire to do so became an obsession, consuming his thoughts and darkening his soul. Unbeknownst to Jonathan, the fragment was not just a relic of the past. It was a key, a gateway for something ancient and malevolent. The ghost of the rack's creator, a torturer from centuries past, had found in him a willing descendant, a vessel to continue a legacy of cruelty long thought to be buried in the annals of history. As Jonathan hunted for the missing pieces of the rack, he failed to notice the changes within himself, the growing darkness in his eyes, the cruel twist in his mouth, the harshness in his voice. The once kind and curious historian was slowly being eroded away, replaced by something far more sinister. The morning sun filtered weakly through the curtains of Jonathan's study, casting long shadows over the ancient fragment of the torture rack that now seemed to dominate the room. Jonathan sat at his desk, his eyes not on the numerous books or the papers strewn about, but fixed intently on the dark piece of wood and iron. Since acquiring it, his nights had been restless, filled with unsettling dreams of shadowy figures and echoing screams. As the days passed, the pull towards the rack grew stronger, an invisible force beckoning him to complete what was once started centuries ago. He found himself scouring antique shops and online auctions, obsessively searching for the remaining parts of the rack. The pursuit consumed him, each waking moment dedicated to this singular, dark purpose. But it wasn't just the rack that was changing. Jonathan himself was undergoing a transformation. His friends and colleagues began to notice a shift in his demeanor. Once a warm and engaging man, he now seemed distant, his once sparkling eyes now dull, and often veering towards a cold glare. Conversations with him became strained, his responses short and sometimes laced with a biting sarcasm that bordered on cruelty. One evening, while having dinner with a close friend, Peter, the change became disturbingly evident. Peter, concerned, had brought up Jonathan's recent obsession. "Jonathan, you're not yourself lately. This fixation with the rack, it's not healthy," he said, his voice laced with worry. Jonathan's response was a cold laugh, a sound that seemed foreign even to his own ears. "Healthy, Peter? You, of all people, should appreciate the historical significance of my find. I'm restoring a piece of history," he replied, his tone dismissive and harsh. Peter, taken aback by the response, tried to reason with him, but Jonathan was unyielding. The conversation quickly escalated, with Jonathan's words turning sharp and cruel, cutting Peter deeply. The evening ended with Peter leaving in dismay, and Jonathan feeling a surge of inexplicable satisfaction from the verbal sparring. Alone in his study later that night, Jonathan sat staring at the rack fragment. The whispers were clearer now, more demanding. They spoke of power, of legacy, of the need to complete the rack. And for the first time, Jonathan felt a sinister pleasure in the thought of it. The idea of wielding such power, the power to inflict pain and command fear, was intoxicating. He delved deeper into his quest to rebuild the rack. Jonathan's interactions with others grew increasingly unsettling. His patience was thin, his temper quick to flare. People began to avoid him, sensing something dark and dangerous brewing beneath the surface. And then, one fateful day, Jonathan found another piece of the rack. The moment he touched it, a jolt of energy coursed through him, and the whispers crescendoed into an overpowering chorus. His vision momentarily blurred, and when it cleared, he saw not his study, but a dark, damp dungeon from another time, with the rack fully assembled, waiting for its next victim. Shaking off the vision, Jonathan realized with a mix of horror and exhilaration that he was no longer in control. The legacy of the torturer was slowly claiming him, reshaping him into an instrument of its will. The line between man and monster was blurring, and the journey towards an inevitable dark destiny was well underway. Jonathan's world had narrowed down to a singular, all-consuming obsession: the reconstruction of the medieval torture rack. Each day, he could feel the ancient spirit of the torturer weaving its dark tendrils tighter around his soul, driving him further from the man he once was. One chilling evening, Jonathan's girlfriend, Emily, visited his home. She had been worried about him. His recent behavior and withdrawal from their relationship had left her both concerned and confused. Emily, with her bright smile and gentle demeanor, represented normalcy that Jonathan was rapidly losing touch with. As they sat together in the living room, attempting to rekindle some semblance of their old, playful and dynamic relationship, something sinister simmered beneath Jonathan's forced smiles. They began to play a mock wrestling game, a common playful act between them. However, this time, as Jonathan pinned Emily down, something within him snapped. "Confess!" he bellowed, his voice unrecognizable, laced with a malice that froze Emily's blood. His hands gripped her arms and legs, pulling them apart with a frightening intensity. Emily, caught completely off guard, struggled beneath his grasp, terror overtaking her. "Jonathan, stop! You're hurting me!" she cried out in panic. The sound of her voice seemed to momentarily break the spell. Releasing her, Jonathan stumbled back, horror-stricken at what he had almost done. Emily, without a word, scrambled to her feet and fled from the house, her departure marking the end of something beautiful that had been irrevocably tarnished by the growing darkness within him. In the days that followed, Jonathan's isolation deepened. His search for the remaining pieces of the rack turned futile, as if the universe itself was denying him the completion of his cursed quest. Desperation clawed at him. He made a decision that would seal his fate. He sought out a local carpenter, a craftsman known for his skill in working with antique restorations. Feigning a scholarly interest in medieval history, Jonathan commissioned him to construct the missing parts of the rack, providing detailed sketches that he had drawn from his visions and the whispers that now rarely ceased. The carpenter, oblivious to the true nature of the project, agreed the task. As he worked, Jonathan watched, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity. With each piece that took shape, the grip of the ancient torturer's spirit tightened, his whispers growing more commanding, filling Jonathan's mind with visions of power and cruelty. When the rack was finally completed, standing ominous and foreboding in Jonathan's study, a chilling sense of accomplishment washed over him. He ran his hands over the cold, smooth surfaces, feeling a connection to the past, soaked in pain and terror. The line between him and the ghostly torturer had all but vanished. Jonathan, once a man of learning and kindness, had been consumed by the legacy of his ancestor. The rack, now whole, stood as a monument to his descent into darkness, a tool waiting to be used in the continuation of centuries-old cruelty and torment. The journey into the abyss was complete, and there was no turning back. In the heart of his foreboding study, surrounded by the shadows of the night, Jonathan stood before the fully assembled torture rack. Its presence filled the room with an ominous air, a silent testament to the darkness that had consumed his soul. The whispers of an ancient torturer were now incessant, urging him to complete the final, ghastly act that would fully bind him to his cursed heritage. Jonathan's mind, once a sanctuary of knowledge and compassion, was now a battleground of sanity and madness. The part of him that still clung to his humanity recoiled at the thought of what he was being compelled to do. Yet the darker part, the part that had grown in the shadow of the rack, craved to experience his power. Driven by this twisted desire, Jonathan devised a malevolent plan. He decided to lure someone into his home under the pretense of needing help with a historical research project. It was a simple, yet deceitful ruse, one that preyed on the kindness of others, a trait he himself had once possessed. After careful consideration, he chose his victim, a young graduate student from the local university, known for her keen interest in medieval history. Jonathan reached out to her, his invitation laced with the promise of exclusive access to his collection of historical artifacts. The student, eager for the opportunity, agreed without hesitation. The night she arrived, Jonathan led her to his study, his heart pounding with a mix of excitement and dread. As she marveled at the collection, he offered her a drink, one he had laced with a sedative. Within minutes, she slumped to the floor unconscious. With a chilling resolve, Jonathan placed her upon the rack. As he began to turn the wheel, the student regained consciousness, her eyes wide with terror. Her screams echoed through the room, a haunting melody to the symphony of whispers in Jonathan's head. But as he watched her body contort in agony, something within him snapped. The last vestiges of his humanity surged forth, horror and revulsion overwhelming the dark ecstasy he had felt moments before. He released the wheel, collapsing to his knees, his hands trembling. The room spun around, the walls seemingly closing in. The whispers turned into thunderous roars, condemning him for his weakness, for his failure to fully embrace his destiny. In his weakened state, both physically and mentally, the spirit of the torturer saw its opportunity. It began to seep into Jonathan's soul, filling every crevice of his being with its malevolent essence. Jonathan felt himself slipping away, his consciousness fading into the background as the torturer's spirit took hold. The young student, seizing the moment, managed to free herself and escape, her departure unnoticed by Jonathan, who was now lost in the depths of his own mind. As the torturer's spirit melded with his, Jonathan's body stood up, but it was no longer Jonathan who looked out from the once kind eyes. The spirit of the ancient torturer had found its vessel, ready to walk the earth once more, to continue a legacy of horror that had been momentarily thwarted by time. The study, once a place of scholarly pursuit, had transformed into a chamber of horrors. The spirit of the ancient torturer, now inhabiting Jonathan's body, reveled in its newfound freedom. The whispers that had once tormented Jonathan were now commands that the torturer heeded with dark delight. The need for victims was pressing, a cruel necessity to cement his hold over Jonathan's body. The spirit understood that it needed to subject someone to the brink of death on the rack to complete the sinister ritual, to bind itself permanently to the mortal realm. Under the guise of Jonathan, the torturer plotted to ensnare another unsuspecting soul. He chose his next victim with care, a solitary individual, unlikely to be immediately missed. Using the same ruse of historical research, he invited a local antiquarian to his home, a man known for his reclusive nature and deep interest in medieval artifacts. The antiquarian, enticed by the prospect of examining Jonathan's collection, arrived one fog-laden evening. He was greeted by a host who seemed a shadow of the man he had expected to meet, his demeanor cold and his eyes devoid of any warmth. Once in the study, the antiquarian's fascination with the artifacts turned to dread as he realized the true nature of his visit. Before he could react, he was overpowered and bound to the rack. The torturer, inhabiting Jonathan's body, began his gruesome work. He turned the rack slowly, savoring each moment of his victim's agony. The screams of the antiquarian echoed through the room, a macabre symphony to which the torturer conducted with sadistic pleasure. Hours passed, the torture unrelenting in his cruelty. The antiquarian, pushed to the very brink of death, lay broken and barely conscious. The spirit inside Jonathan relished the pain he inflicted, drawing strength from the suffering he caused. As the dawn's first light crept into the room, the deed was done. The torturer, feeling the final bonds securing him to Jonathan's body, stood triumphant. Jonathan's body was now his vessel, permanently bound to the torturer's malevolent spirit. The antiquarian, left in a state between life and death, was a testament to the completion of the ritual. The torturer, in his new mortal form, reveled in the knowledge that he could now walk the earth, continuing his legacy of terror. The study, with the rack at its centre, had become a shrine to unspeakable acts. The spirit of the torturer, once confined to the whispers of the past, was now free, its hunger for suffering and pain unquenchable. The morning light had barely touched the earth when the sound of forceful banging shattered the eerie silence of Jonathan's home. The police had arrived, alerted by the young student who had narrowly escaped the horrors of the study. Their urgent knocks echoed through the halls, a stark contrast to the sinister calm within. The torturer, now fully inhabiting Jonathan's body, felt no fear or concern. With a chilling smile, he glided towards the door, his movement imbued with a dark grace. The spirit within him was reveling in its newfound power, eager to confront any who dared to challenge its reign. As he opened the door, 2 burly police officers burst in, their faces set in expressions of determination and shock. Their eyes quickly found the antiquarian still bound to the rack, his body a testament to the unspeakable cruelty inflicted upon him. Without hesitation, the officers moved to apprehend the torturer. But to their disbelief, he merely laughed, a sound that seemed to emanate from the depths of hell itself. With an ease that defied belief, he brushed them aside as if they were small children, his strength amplified by the malevolent spirit that controlled him. The officers, stunned by the display of power, attempted to regroup and tackle him. They were no match for the supernatural force they faced. With swift, brutal efficiency, the torturer struck them down, rendering them unconscious with ease. His laughter filled the room as he dragged one of the officers to the rack. With a twisted sense of excitement, he began to turn the wheel, relishing the sound of bones breaking and flesh tearing. The rack, pushed beyond its limits, groaned under the strain of its sadistic delight. As the torturer stood back, admiring his handiwork, a transformation began to take place. Jonathan's features, once kind and gentle, morphed into a visage of pure evil. The face of the ancient torturer emerged, his cruel eyes gleaming with a malevolent joy. This physical change was the final seal, the complete fusion of the spirit with Jonathan's body. With the transformation complete, the torturer walked out of the house, stepping into the light of a new day. His appearance was now that of the medieval torturer, a figure from a nightmare made flesh. As he walked, his laughter echoed through the streets, a chilling herald of the terror that had been unleashed upon the world. The house, once a haven of scholarly pursuit, now stood as a silent witness to the birth of a new era of darkness. The police, and soon the world, would come to realize the full extent of the horror that had taken place within its walls. But for now, the torturer walked free, his power absolute, his hunger for suffering and pain boundless. The city was in turmoil, following the gruesome discoveries at Jonathan's home. The police, amidst a flurry of investigation and public outcry, found themselves at a dead end. Jonathan, the man they sought, had vanished without a trace. The transformation that had taken place within him had rendered him unrecognizable, his features altered by the malevolent spirit that had now controlled him. Meanwhile, the torturer, wearing the guise of a new face, moved through the city's underbelly unnoticed. He was a shadow, weaving his way through society, his true nature concealed behind a mask of normalcy. With each passing day, his influence grew, reaching into the corners of power and corruption. As he ascended the ranks of the clandestine networks that thrived in the dark, his presence became known among those who wielded power from the shadows. His cruelty and strength, his ability to instill fear and obedience, quickly earned him a place among them. One evening, in a dimly lit room where the city's most influential and corrupt gathered, the torturer, took his place at the head of the table, his eyes cold and calculating, swept over the faces of those who sat before him. They were people of influence, politicians, business tycoons, criminal overlords, each a cog in the machine of power and control. The room fell in silence as he stood to speak, his voice carrying an undeniable authority. "We sit in high places," he began, his tone dark and commanding. "In the shadows of power, we pull the strings of this city. We shape its destiny." He paused, his gaze piercing each person in the room. "We are legion," he continued, a sinister smile playing on his lips. "Our reach is far, our grasp unyielding. Together, we shall steer the course of this world into a new era." The people in the room nodded, a mixture of fear and respect evident in their eyes. They understood the power they were witnessing, a force unlike any they had encountered before. In the mists sat not just a man, but a manifestation of an ancient cruelty and darkness, now reborn in the modern world. Outside, the city continued its nightly bustle, oblivious to the fact that a new shadow had fallen over it. In the halls of power, the torturer sat, his influence spreading like a dark web. His reign had begun, a reign that promised to be as long and as cruel as that of the spirit that now inhabited him. And so, the world unknowingly turned under the watchful gaze of a tormentor from the past, a being whose thirst for power and suffering knew no bounds. The legacy of the torturer, once confined to the annals of history, was now etched into the present, a dark echo resonating through the corridors of power.
And if you're still looking to fulfill your thirst for more horror, don't forget to check out this next video, unless of course you're frozen with fear already.